Well, my landlord Marcus thought he had me figured out completely wrong. He saw a young Latina woman, fresh out of college, working 2 jobs just to afford his overpriced studio apartment, and he figured I'd be an easy target. What he didn't know was that my abuela didn't raise any pushovers, and I had just finished my degree in business law with a minor that would come in very handy later. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. It started innocently enough. I'd been living in this cramped studio for 8 months, always paying rent 3 days early because I knew Marcus was the type to pounce on any excuse to cause problems. The apartment was nothing special. Thin walls, a bathroom door that wouldn't close properly, and a kitchen so small you could touch both walls with your arms stretched out. But it was mine, and in this expensive city, finding anything affordable was like winning the lottery. Marcus owned the entire building, a converted warehouse with 12 units that he'd clearly renovated on the cheapest possible budget. He lived in the penthouse suite on the top floor and made sure everyone knew he was watching. This man had cameras everywhere, not for security, but because he got off on monitoring his tenants like we were lab rats in his personal experiment. The first red flag should have been during my initial walkthrough. Marcus kept making these subtle comments about how I should really consider if I could handle the responsibility and asking if my parents would be co-signing. When I told him I didn't need a co-signer and handed him first month's rent, last month's rent, and security deposit in cash, his whole demeanor shifted. Suddenly, I wasn't the irresponsible young woman he'd pegged me for, and I could see that bothered him more than it should have. But I needed the place, so I signed the lease and moved in, thinking I could just keep my head down and avoid any drama. That was my first mistake. The harassment started small. Marcus would show up for surprise inspections that weren't mentioned anywhere in my lease agreement. He'd let himself in with his master key, claiming he'd knocked, but I hadn't answered, even when I was clearly at work. I'd come home to find my belongings slightly moved, my personal items obviously rifled through, and that smug look on his face when I'd run into him in the hallway. "Just making sure everything's up to code," he'd say with this oil-slick smile. "Can't be too careful with tenants these days." Then came the noise complaints. According to Marcus, I was apparently the loudest tenant in building history. Never mind that Mrs. Rodriguez in 3B practiced salsa dancing until midnight, or that the college guys in 2A threw parties every weekend that shook the entire building. No, somehow my crime was existing while Latina, and every footstep I took was apparently grounds for a formal complaint. He started slipping written warnings under my door. Excessive noise during quiet hours. Disturbing other tenants. Violation of lease terms regarding peaceful enjoyment. I kept every single one of those ridiculous notices, filing them away in a folder that was growing thicker by the week. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening in October. I'd just gotten home from my second job, exhausted and looking forward to heating up some leftover soup and maybe watching Netflix before bed. I was literally tiptoeing around my own apartment because Marcus had threatened eviction over noise violations when I heard his key in my lock. "Emergency inspection," he announced, barging in without waiting for me to respond. "We've had reports of water damage." I was standing there in my work uniform, a polo shirt and khakis from the retail job that was slowly killing my soul, and this man just waltzed into my space like he owned not just the building, but me too. He started poking around, opening cabinets, checking under my sink, making a big show of looking for problems that clearly didn't exist. "Sir, I need to ask you to leave," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "You can't just enter my apartment without proper notice." He turned around with that same smug expression, but this time there was something darker in his eyes. "Actually, I can. It's right there in your lease agreement, Section 12. Emergency situations give me full access to ensure the safety and integrity of my property." This isn't an emergency situation. Water damage is always an emergency, sweetheart. and I'm starting to think you might be more trouble than you're worth." That word, sweetheart, said with such condescension that it made my skin crawl. In that moment, something clicked. This wasn't about inspections or noise complaints or water damage. This was about control. Marcus had decided I didn't belong in his building, and he was going to make my life miserable until I gave up and left. But here's what Marcus didn't know about me. I don't give up. Ever. After he finally left, taking his sweet time and making sure to comment on everything from my ethnic cooking smells to my unprofessional decorating choices, I sat down at my tiny kitchen table and opened my laptop. If Marcus wanted to play games with lease agreements and property law, he'd picked the wrong tenant. See, that minor I mentioned earlier? It wasn't in art history or psychology like most of my classmates chose. It was in real estate law. I'd spent 2 years learning every trick landlords use to exploit tenants, every loophole they abuse, and every legal protection that exists to stop them. I'd written my senior thesis on predatory rental practices in urban markets, and Marcus was about to become my star case study. I started with the lease agreement, reading through every single line with the attention to detail that had earned me a 4.0 GPA. It didn't take long to find the first problem. That emergency inspection clause Marcus loved to quote, it required 24-hour written notice except in cases of immediate threat to life or property. A vague report of possible water. Damage that he couldn't even specify the source of didn't qualify. But that was just the beginning. The more I dug into the lease terms, the more violations I found. The security deposit was being held in Marcus's personal account instead of the legally required escrow account. The rent increases he'd been threatening weren't properly documented or within legal limits. And those surprise inspections he'd been conducting monthly? They violated tenant privacy laws in at least 6 different ways. I spent the next 3 hours documenting everything, cross-referencing dates, taking screenshots, and building a case that would make my business law professor proud. But I wasn't planning to go to court. Not yet. I had something much more creative in mind. The next morning, I called in sick to both my jobs and spent the day at the public library, using their high-speed internet and printer to research everything I could. Find about Marcus Thornfield and his property management business, social media, business licenses, previous tenant complaints, city inspection records. I pulled it all together like I was investigating a Fortune 500 company. What I found was exactly what I expected, and somehow worse than I'd imagined. Marcus had a pattern. Young women, recent immigrants, college students, anyone he perceived as vulnerable or unlikely to fight back. The complaint record with the City Housing Authority read like a horror story, but nothing ever seemed to stick. He was too smart, too careful, always staying just barely within legal bounds while making his tenants' lives absolutely miserable. But he'd made one crucial mistake with me. He'd assumed I was just another easy target, and that assumption was about to cost him everything. Over the next few days, I started connecting dots that painted an even uglier picture. Marcus owned 3 other buildings in the area, all run the same way. He had a systematic approach to tenant intimidation that he'd perfected over years. The man was a predator in a perfectly pressed suit, and he'd gotten away with it for far too long. I discovered that he'd been collecting application fees from prospective tenants even when units weren't actually available, pocketing hundreds of dollars from desperate apartment hunters. He charged illegal pet deposits that weren't refundable regardless of lease terms. And those security deposits he was supposed to return within 30 days of move-out? Most former tenants never saw a penny, and Marcus would claim damages that were either fabricated or normal wear and tear. The more I dug, the angrier I became. This wasn't just about me anymore. This was about every single person Marcus had bullied, cheated, and intimidated over the years. Every young woman who'd moved out in tears because she couldn't handle his harassment. Every immigrant family who'd lost their security deposit to his fake damage claims. every college student who'd been evicted on trumped-up charges. Marcus thought. He was untouchable because his victims were exactly the kind of people who couldn't fight back. People without connections, without legal knowledge, without the time or resources to challenge him. But I was about to prove him very, very wrong. I started planning my revenge that night, and I knew it had to be perfect. Not illegal, not dangerous, not anything that could come back to hurt me later, but devastating in the way that only comes from someone understanding exactly how the system works and using it against the person who's been abusing it. The first phase of my plan was simple: document everything. I installed a hidden camera app on my old phone and started recording every interaction with Marcus. I photographed every written notice he slipped under my door, every violation he claimed to find during his illegal inspections, every smug comment he made about my lifestyle choices. I also started reaching out to other tenants in the building, carefully and casually. During laundry room conversations and chance meetings in the hallway, I'd mention Marcus's behavior and gauge their reactions. What I found didn't surprise me, but absolutely infuriated me. Every single tenant had stories. Every single one had been harassed, overcharged, or intimidated in some way. Mrs. Rodriguez, the sweet lady who practiced salsa dancing, had been threatened with eviction because Marcus claimed her music was culturally inappropriate for the building's professional atmosphere. The college guys in 2A were being charged extra fees for excessive occupancy, even though they were both on the lease. The elderly man in 1C had been told his medication deliveries were disrupting building operations, and he needed to have them sent elsewhere. Marcus had created a climate of fear in his own building, and everyone was too scared to speak up because they couldn't afford to lose their homes. But fear works both ways, and Marcus was about to learn what it felt like to be the vulnerable one. I spent the next week implementing phase 2 of my plan: research and networking. I reached out to every tenant rights organization in the city, every legal aid society, every housing advocacy group I could find. I presented myself as a concerned citizen doing research for a community journalism project, and suddenly I had access to resources and information that Marcus never expected a simple retail worker to possess. Through these connections, I learned about other properties Marcus owned and the complaints filed against them. I discovered he'd been cited multiple times for code violations, but had connections at City Hall who helped him minimize the penalties. I found out about the city council member who'd been pushing for stricter tenant protection laws that Marcus had been quietly lobbying against through shell companies and dummy organizations. But the most valuable thing I learned was about an upcoming citywide investigation into predatory landlord practices. The housing authority was finally cracking down, and they were looking for test cases to make examples of the worst offenders. Marcus had no idea he was already on their radar, but I was about to make sure he moved to the very top of their list. The third phase of my plan was the most delicate: building my case while appearing completely compliant. I continued paying rent early, responding politely to Marcus's harassment, and maintaining the facade of the intimidated young tenant he believed me to be. But behind the scenes, I was preparing for war. I documented every illegal entry into my apartment with timestamps and photo evidence. I recorded phone conversations where Marcus made discriminatory comments about my ethnicity and gender. I compiled a comprehensive file of lease violations, city code infractions, and tenant rights abuses that read like a prosecutor's dream case. But I wasn't done yet. Marcus wanted to play psychological games? Fine. I was about to show him what a real mind game looked like. I started leaving little signs that I was onto his illegal activities, but in ways that couldn't be traced back to me directly. A tenant rights pamphlet accidentally left in the lobby where he'd see it. Legal statutes about security deposit requirements printed out and mistakenly dropped in the hallway outside his office. A business card from a tenant rights lawyer wedged in his mailbox like junk mail. but positioned where he couldn't miss it. Marcus began to get paranoid, and paranoid people make mistakes. He started overreacting to minor things, sending increasingly aggressive notices that violated more laws with each one. He began entering apartments more frequently, but now his illegal inspections were becoming desperate fishing expeditions as he tried to find something, anything, to justify his harassment, and that's when I knew he was ready for the final phase of my plan. Marcus had been systematically destroying the lives of vulnerable tenants for years, thinking he was invincible because of his position and connections. But he was about to discover that real power doesn't come from intimidation and exploitation. It comes from knowledge, preparation, and the patience to wait for exactly the right moment to strike back. Marcus wanted a war? He was about to get one, and he had no idea that he'd already lost. My Landlord's Rough Ride, Part 2. The moment I'd been waiting for came on a Friday morning in November. Marcus had scheduled what he called a comprehensive building inspection for that weekend, giving all tenants exactly 12 hours notice in violation of state law. But this time, instead of cowering in my apartment like he expected, I was ready with my trump card. I'd spent weeks preparing for this exact scenario, and Marcus had just walked straight into my trap. The inspection notice he'd slipped under everyone's doctor was a masterpiece of illegal landlord overreach. He was demanding access to all personal belongings and storage areas for health and safety verification. He claimed the right to photograph tenant property for insurance documentation. And the cherry on top? He was bringing what he called building assessors, who were actually just his buddies coming to scope out which apartments had valuable items worth noting for future violations. But here's what Marcus didn't know. I'd been in contact with Maria Santos, a senior investigator with the city's housing authority, for the past 3 weeks. Maria had been building a case against predatory landlords, and when I'd presented her with my meticulously documented evidence of Marcus's illegal practices, she'd practically salivated at the opportunity to nail him. That Friday morning, while Marcus was probably planning his weekend power trip, I was on a conference call with Maria, 2 tenant rights lawyers, and a representative from the state attorney general's office. By noon, they'd obtained an emergency restraining order preventing Marcus from conducting any inspections until a formal investigation could be completed. But I wasn't going to simply serve him legal papers and call it a day. Marcus had made this personal when he'd invaded my privacy, insulted my heritage, and tried to intimidate me out of my home. He deserved to experience the same fear and helplessness he'd inflicted on countless tenants over the years. So I decided to deliver the restraining order in person, with a few special additions of my own. I knocked on Marcus's penthouse door at exactly 2 p.m., dressed in my best business attire and carrying a leather portfolio that made me look like the lawyer I was about to become. When he opened the door, I could see the confusion in his eyes. This wasn't the scared little tenant he'd been bullying for months. "Good afternoon, Mr. Thornfield. I have some documents that require your immediate attention." The official restraining order was just the beginning. Behind it, I'd prepared a comprehensive legal filing that detailed every single violation I'd documented over the past months. Illegal entry, discriminatory harassment, improper handling of security deposits, violation of tenant privacy rights, failure to maintain habitable living conditions. The list went on for 14 pages. But the real shock came when Marcus reached the final page and saw the letterhead: Sofia Ramirez, JD candidate, State University College of Law, Tenant Rights Clinic. "You're a law student?" he stammered, his face going pale. "Graduating in 6 months with a specialty in housing law." But that's not the best part. I pulled out another document, this one with an even more impressive letterhead. "This is from the investigative journalism program at the local university. They're doing a documentary about predatory landlords in urban areas, and congratulations, you're going to be their star subject." The blood drained from Marcus's face as he realized what I was telling him. Everything he'd said and done was about to become public record, broadcast to the entire city as an example of exactly the kind of landlord abuse that housing advocates had been fighting against. "You can't do this," he said, but his voice had lost all its usual confidence. "Actually, I can, and I am. But here's the thing, Marcus. I'm not unreasonable. We can resolve this the easy way or the hard way. Your choice." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The easy way, I explained, involved Marcus voluntarily agreeing to a comprehensive audit of all his properties, returning illegally collected fees to former and current tenants, and submitting to ongoing oversight from the housing authority. He would also need to attend mandatory training on tenant rights and fair housing laws, and agree to sell his properties within 2 years to buyers who would actually maintain them properly. The hard way involved criminal charges, civil lawsuits, from multiple tenants, media exposure that would destroy his reputation, and regulatory investigations that would likely result in the seizure of his properties and massive financial penalties. Marcus tried to bluster and threaten, but his heart wasn't in it anymore. He could see the walls closing in, and for the first time in years, he was the one who felt powerless and afraid. And "I need time to think about this," he said finally. "You have until Monday morning." "But Marcus?" I paused at his door, letting him see the cold satisfaction in my eyes. "The investigation is already underway. The media interviews are already scheduled. The only thing you get to choose is whether you're portrayed as a predator who finally got caught, or someone who realized his mistakes and tried to make things right." That weekend was the quietest the building had ever been. No surprise inspections, no harassment, no power games. Marcus had retreated to his penthouse like a wounded animal, probably calling every lawyer and politician he knew, trying to find a way out of the trap I'd built around him. But I'd been thorough. Every connection he had, every favor he might call in, every loophole he might try to exploit. I'd already accounted for all of it. This wasn't amateur hour anymore. This was a carefully orchestrated takedown by someone who understood the system better than he ever had. Monday morning came, and Marcus requested a meeting. When I arrived at his office, he looked like he'd aged 10 years over the weekend. The arrogant swagger was gone, replaced by the desperate panic of a man who finally understood that his actions had consequences. "What do you want?" he asked quietly. "Justice," I replied. "Not just for me, but for every tenant you've bullied and cheated over the years." Over the next hour, we negotiated the terms of his surrender. Marcus would cooperate fully with the housing authority investigation. He would return over $40,000 in illegally collected fees and deposits to current and former tenants. He would bring all his properties up to code within 90 days and submit to monthly inspections. And he would publicly apologize for his discriminatory practices while agreeing to sensitivity training and community service. But the most satisfying part of our agreement was the personal element. Marcus had to write a formal letter of apology to me, acknowledging his harassment and discrimination, and admitting that he had underestimated my intelligence and capabilities because of his own prejudices. Watching him sign those documents was one of the most gratifying moments of my life. For months, Marcus had tried to make me feel small, powerless, and unwelcome in my own home. Now he was the one signing papers that acknowledged his wrongdoing, his eyes never quite meeting mine as he realized how completely he'd been outmaneuvered. The news broke the following Wednesday. Local landlord agrees to sweeping reforms after. Tenant rights investigation, read the headline in the city's largest newspaper. The article detailed Marcus's pattern of abuse and the comprehensive settlement that would serve as a model for future tenant protection cases. But the real victory came in the weeks that followed, as Marcus was forced to live up to his agreements, under the watchful eye of the housing authority. The illegal fees were returned with interest. The building was renovated to meet actual safety codes. The harassment stopped completely, replaced by the awkward politeness of a man who knew he was being monitored for any sign of backsliding. Other tenants started coming forward with their own stories, emboldened by seeing that it was possible to fight back and win. Mrs. Rodriguez got her security deposit back plus damages for the emotional distress of Marcus's discriminatory comments about her cultural practices. The college students received refunds for the illegal occupancy fees. The elderly gentleman in 1C got a formal apology and assurance that his medical deliveries would never be questioned again. One by one, Marcus's other properties came under investigation as more tenants found the courage to report his abuses. The man who had built his wealth on the backs of vulnerable people was slowly being stripped of his power, one legal violation at a time. But perhaps the sweetest revenge was watching Marcus's reputation crumble in the tight-knit real estate community. Word spread quickly about the landlord who'd been outsmarted by a young tenant he'd tried to intimidate. Property management companies stopped referring clients to him. Real estate investors avoided his listings. The network of cronies who'd helped him get away with his predatory practices suddenly found him toxic to their own reputations. Marcus had spent years building his image as a successful, untouchable businessman who could manipulate the system to his advantage. In less than 2 months, I'd destroyed that image completely, replacing it with the reality of what he truly was. A small-minded bully who'd finally picked on someone who knew how to fight back. The investigation expanded beyond Marcus to examine the broader patterns of abuse in the local rental market. Housing laws were strengthened, tenant protection resources were expanded, and a scholarship fund was established to help low-income tenants access legal representation when facing landlord harassment. Marcus's downfall had become a catalyst for systemic change that would protect countless future tenants from experiencing what I'd gone through. But the personal satisfaction went deeper than any policy victory. Every morning when I walked through the lobby of our building, I saw the changes my rebellion had brought about. Fresh paint covered the water stains Marcus had ignored for years. The broken security door actually locked properly now. The heating system worked consistently instead of cutting out whenever Marcus decided to save money on utilities. Most importantly, the atmosphere of fear that had permeated the building was gone. Tenants smiled and made conversation in the hallways, instead of hurrying past each other with their heads down. People felt safe in their own homes again, no longer worried that any normal activity might result in harassment or eviction threats. Marcus still lived in the penthouse, but he was a different man now. The swagger was gone, replaced by the nervous awareness of someone who knew he was being watched. He'd nod politely when we passed in the hallway, but there was no more of the predatory gleam in his eyes. He'd learned, perhaps for the first time in his life, what it felt like to be powerless. And every month when I wrote my rent check, always exactly on time, never early anymore, I'd include a little note reminding Marcus of the ongoing investigations, the community service requirements, or the sensitivity training sessions he was required to attend. Just small reminders that his days of unchecked power were over, and that I would be watching to make sure he never forgot the lessons I'd taught him. The war was over, and Marcus hadn't just lost. He'd been completely and utterly defeated by the very person he'd most underestimated. But as satisfying as that victory was, I knew it was only the beginning of the justice he truly deserved. My Landlord's Rough Ride. Part 3. 6 months after Marcus's initial surrender, I thought our story was over. I'd graduated law school, passed the bar exam, and even got a job offer from the tenant rights clinic where I'd honed my skills dismantling his predatory empire. Marcus had been keeping his head down, following the settlement terms, and slowly fading into the background of irrelevance where he belonged. But karma wasn't finished with him yet. It started with a phone call on a Tuesday morning in late spring. I was in my new office, reviewing case files for actual paying clients now, when my assistant buzzed through. "Sophia, there's a Detective Morrison on line 2. Says it's about your former landlord situation." My blood went cold. In all my planning and execution of Marcus's downfall, I'd been meticulously careful to stay within legal bounds. Every move I'd made was documented, justified, and completely above board. But still, that word detective sent a chill down my spine. Ms. Ramirez, I'm calling about Marcus Thornfield. We understand you were instrumental in the investigation that led to his settlement with the housing authority? Yes, that's correct. Is there a problem? Not with your actions, ma'am. Actually, we're hoping you might help us with something much bigger. Can you come down to the station? There are some things about Mr. Thornfield that we think you should see. An hour later, I was sitting in Detective Morrison's office, staring at photographs and documents that made my carefully constructed case against Marcus look like a parking ticket by comparison. What I'd uncovered was just the tip of an iceberg. That went much deeper and darker than I'd ever imagined. Marcus hadn't just been a predatory landlord. He'd been running what amounted to an organized criminal enterprise, using his properties as fronts for money laundering, tax evasion, and fraud, schemes that stretched back over a decade. The tenant harassment I'd experienced wasn't just power tripping. It was a systematic method of maintaining high tenant turnover to hide the financial crimes happening behind the scenes. We've been investigating Thornfield for 2 years, Detective Morrison explained, but we could never get close enough to gather solid evidence. His tenants were too scared to talk. His business records were buried in shell companies, and he had enough political connections to deflect most inquiries. But when your housing authority case broke his operation open, it gave us the opening we needed. The detective spread out financial records that showed Marcus had been using security deposits from multiple properties as seed money for illegal investment schemes. He'd been claiming phantom tenants for tax purposes while simultaneously collecting government subsidies for low-income housing that he was actually renting at market rates. And the emergency inspections he'd been conducting weren't just harassment. He was photographing tenant belongings to assess what could be stolen and resold if someone suddenly needed to be evicted. We estimate he's stolen over $2 million from tenants and taxpayers over the past 8 years, Morrison continued. But here's the thing. Most of his victims don't even know they were victims. The beauty of his system was that people thought they were just dealing with a difficult landlord, not realizing they were being robbed blind by a criminal enterprise. I sat there processing this information, feeling a mix of vindication and horror. Vindication because my instincts about Marcus had been even more accurate than I'd realized. Horror because it meant dozens, maybe hundreds of people had been victimized, far worse than I'd ever been. What do you need from me? I asked. We need someone who understands his methods, someone the other victims will trust, and someone who knows tenant law well enough to help us unravel 8 years of criminal activity. We're offering you a consultant position with the district attorney's office if you're interested. 2 weeks later, I was leading the largest tenant fraud investigation in the city's history. We'd set up a victim assistance center in a community center near Marcus's properties, and every day, more people came forward with stories that broke my heart and fueled my determination to see him face real justice. There was Elena, an elderly woman who'd lost her entire life savings to Marcus's fake building assessment fees. She'd been paying an extra $300 a month for 2 years, believing it was for necessary structural repairs that never actually happened. There was David, a veteran with PTSD who'd been systematically overcharged for utilities while Marcus pocketed the difference. The stress of the financial burden had worsened David's condition to the point where he'd been hospitalized twice, medical bills he couldn't afford piling up while Marcus got richer. There was the Nguyen family, recent immigrants who'd paid Marcus $15,000 in cultural accommodation fees that had no legal basis whatsoever. He'd convinced them it was required for non-English speakers, exploiting their unfamiliarity with American housing laws to steal money they'd saved for years. Each story made me angrier, but also more determined. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about justice for people who'd been robbed of their dignity, their savings, and their sense of security by a predator who'd systematically targeted the most vulnerable members of our community. The investigation took 4 months to complete, and when we finally had everything documented, the criminal case against Marcus was overwhelming. Fraud, grand theft, money laundering, tax evasion, racketeering. The charges kept multiplying as we uncovered more layers of his criminal operation. But Marcus still had one card left to play, and it was a desperate one. 3 days before his criminal trial was set to begin, Marcus's high-priced defense attorney reached out with an offer. Marcus wanted to meet with me privately, claiming he had information that would be mutually beneficial to both of us. Against the advice of the prosecutors, I agreed to the meeting, but only with Detective Morrison present and everything recorded. Marcus looked terrible. The stress of the investigation had taken its toll, and the confident predator I'd first encountered had been replaced by a broken man who clearly understood his life was about to change permanently. But there was still something calculating in his eyes, a hint of the manipulator who thought he could find an angle to exploit. "Sophia," he began, and I immediately cut him off. "Ms. Ramirez, we're not friends, Marcus. What do you want?" "I want to make a deal. Full confession, cooperation with the prosecution, restitution for all victims. In exchange, I testify against the city officials who helped me cover this up for years." This was the bombshell I'd been waiting for. Marcus's political connections hadn't just been networking, they'd been active participants in his criminal enterprise, taking bribes and kickbacks in exchange for looking the other way while he robbed his tenants blind. "I can give you a city council member, 2 housing inspectors, and a deputy mayor," Marcus continued. "All of them took money from me to ignore violations, approve fake permits, and suppress tenant complaints. But I want immunity for the racketeering charges and a maximum of 5 years in minimum security." I looked at Detective Morrison, who gave me a slight nod. We'd suspected the corruption went higher up, but we hadn't been able to prove it. Marcus's testimony could bring down an entire network of officials who'd enabled his crimes. "Counteroffer," I said. "Full restitution plus punitive damages, 15 years in federal prison, no minimum security, forfeiture of all properties and assets, and you don't just testify, you wear a wire and help us catch them in the act." Marcus's face went pale. "That's not a deal. That's a death sentence." "No, Marcus. A death sentence is what you gave to Elena when you stole her life savings. It's what you gave to David when you drove him to the hospital with stress-induced panic attacks. It's what you gave to the Nguyen family when you exploited their immigration status to rob them blind." I leaned forward, making sure he could see the cold fury in my eyes. "You spent years thinking you were smarter than everyone else, that you could manipulate and exploit people without consequences. But you made one fatal mistake. You picked on someone who understood the system better than you did, and now that system is going to crush you completely." Marcus tried to negotiate, but his position was hopeless and he knew it. The evidence against him was overwhelming. The victims were demanding justice, and the media attention had made him the poster child for predatory landlord abuse. His only choice was between a long prison sentence and an even longer one. He took the deal. The wire operation was beautiful to watch. Over the course of 3 weeks, Marcus met with his corrupt contacts, discussing bribes and cover-ups while federal agents recorded every word. One by one, the officials who'd enabled his crimes were arrested, their own careers and reputations destroyed by their greed and complicity. The city council member was caught on tape laughing about tenant complaints while counting the cash Marcus had given him. The housing inspectors were recorded planning to falsify inspection reports in exchange for continued payments. The deputy mayor was captured discussing how to use his influence to make criminal investigations disappear. When the arrests were made, it sent shockwaves through the entire city government. The mayor called for a complete overhaul of housing oversight. New laws were passed requiring independent monitoring of landlord compliance. A victim compensation fund was established using assets seized from Marcus and his co-conspirators. But the most satisfying moment came during Marcus's sentencing hearing. As part of his plea agreement, he was required to face his victims in court and personally apologize for his crimes. One by one, the people he'd hurt stood up and told him exactly how his actions had affected their lives. Elena spoke about the nights she'd lain awake worrying about money, about having to choose between medication and food because Marcus had stolen her savings. David described the panic attacks and hospitalizations, the way Marcus's harassment had worsened his PTSD and nearly destroyed his mental health. The Nguyen family talked about the shame and fear they'd felt, believing they were somehow at fault for being victimized. When it was my turn to speak, I looked directly at Marcus and said, "You saw a young Latina woman and thought you could intimidate me into silence. You thought my ethnicity and my gender made me weak, made me easy prey for your schemes. But you were wrong about everything, and that mistake cost you everything." The judge sentenced Marcus to 18 years in federal prison, with no possibility of parole for 12 years. His properties were sold to pay restitution to his victims, with any remaining funds going to tenant advocacy programs. His criminal network was dismantled, his political connections were in prison, and his reputation was destroyed beyond any possibility of redemption. As I watched the bailiffs lead Marcus away in handcuffs, I felt a profound sense of closure. The scared young woman who'd been intimidated by surprise inspections and harassment was gone, replaced by someone who'd learned that real power comes from knowledge, preparation, and the courage to fight for what's right. The case made national news as an example of how tenant advocates and law enforcement could work together to bring down predatory landlords. I was offered jobs with federal agencies, private firms, and advocacy organizations from across the country. But I chose to stay local, opening my own practice, specializing in tenant rights and housing fraud. Marcus's building was sold to a nonprofit housing organization that converted it into truly affordable units with tenant protections written into every lease. Mrs. Rodriguez still lives there, practicing her salsa dancing without fear of harassment. The college students graduated and moved on, but not before writing thank you letters describing how standing up to Marcus had taught them to never accept abuse from people in power. As for me, I kept my apartment in the building for another year, just because I could. Every morning, I'd walk through that lobby where Marcus had once strutted around like a petty tyrant, and I'd smile knowing that his reign of terror was over forever. Marcus thought he could break me, but instead, I broke his entire criminal empire. He thought he was untouchable, but I proved that everyone faces consequences eventually. He thought he was the predator, but in the end, he discovered that he'd been hunting someone far more dangerous than he'd ever imagined. The young woman he'd tried to intimidate had become the lawyer who'd destroyed his life. And every day he spends in prison, he has to live with the knowledge that his downfall came at the hands of someone he'd thought was powerless. That's not just revenge. That's justice. And Marcus got exactly what he deserved, even if it took longer than I'd originally planned. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.